everyone. Good evening. It's April 3rd, 2025, and welcome to another one of our branches on the vine with those wonderful folks from Aleph Beta. I enjoy the connections across the entire scripture, the idea of putting ourselves in other shoes, the idea of understanding the characters. I'm reminded that these were real people. They all had agendas. Here at the Dusty Feet, we often try on sandals for the good and the not so good. So this series from Rabbi David Fohrman had caught my attention. Could you become Haman? I was intrigued by what I saw, so I thought we might want to discuss it. So here we go with Could We Become Haman? It's our part 4 on the Dusty Feet. And before we forget, if you find these kind of podcasts useful, then you click the subscribe button, please. But the reminders, they just help you. Also, if you think these might be useful to others, it's when you click that like button, because that is how YouTube chooses to share these to more people if they wish. So the Scroll of Esther. It's an interesting story. It's one of 2 scrolls in our collection of scripture that never mentions God by name. The other is a Song of Solomon. Do you realize the name of God is never mentioned? Yet the story and the history behind this scroll still think is well worth our time. Now I expect this to be a 5 or 6 part series as we explore the history and the cultural connections that put us in this story about Esther and the rescue from attempted genocide. So let's pick up where we left off with episode 3 of this series. Listen to the story as Rabbi Fohrman continues to unveil it. Enjoy.
So, thus far we've seen one tree of knowledge story in the Megillah, the story of Haman and Zeresh. I want to make an audacious suggestion to you that there is actually a second tree of knowledge story playing out in the Megillah at the same time. If the first story involves the bad guys, Haman and Zeresh, the second tree of knowledge story involves the good guys, Mordecai and Esther. What we're going to see is that as we go through the story involving Mordecai and Esther, we're going to find a whole series of literary parallels linking us back to the tree of knowledge here too. What does it all mean? Well, we'll have to trace the parallels and see where the evidence points us. But the intriguing possibility here is that perhaps Mordecai and Esther are struggling with the same issue that Haman and Zeresh were struggling with. What do we mean when we talk about good? Do you confuse the good in the sense of what I want with the good in the sense of what's right and just and moral? Or can you effectively separate those two and understand the difference between them? But let's not jump too far ahead. Let's look at the parallels that the Megillah lays out for us. Okay, let's go back to the beginning of the Megillah and play this little game. What reminds us of the Garden of Eden here? So do you remember that moment where, Vashti is done away with and the king is all alone? He doesn't have a mate, he doesn't have a wife. So he figures, I'm going to convene a contest. I'm going to gather together all the possible mates and select one among them who I really like. Now, of course, the king, he's a royal guy, and he's going to gather together all these women who, are basically inferior to him on the social totem pole. They're commoners, and he's the king, but it doesn't matter. He's going to accept one of them. He doesn't really care where they come from. And in the end, of course, he picks Esther. Now, this is one of those moments in the Megillah where you sort of seem to see at least the hidden hand of God. Esther was a 1 in a million pick, and she becomes the secret daughter of Israel in the palace. And later on, of course, she's going to become instrumental to saving the Jews. So it might seem fair to say that at least on some level, God is the one that picks out this mate for Ahasuerus. So now stand back and ask yourself, does this remind you of anything at the very beginning of Genesis? Where else in the entire Hebrew Bible do you find a contest convened in which there are all of these possible mates, people who are sort of inherently inferior, that are convened to see if this special person could find a mate among them? And in the end, he doesn't find any of those. He finds a special person picked for him by God himself. You find it back in the Garden of Eden. Adam is all alone. God convenes all of Adam's inferiors, the beasts of the field, in an attempt to find someone who could be his special mate. In the end, Adam rejects all of the animals one by one until God puts him to sleep. But he wakes up to find the mate that God himself has chosen for him, a special person by the name of Eve. And almost to hammer home the comparison between the two stories, the Megillah lets you know the device that Achashverosh used to select the special mate. He would call her by name. Lo tavo od el hamelech, ki im chafetz ba hamelech v'nikra'a b'shem. Any given woman would never come back to the king unless he called her by name. What does that remind you of in the garden? Naming was the device that Adam as well had used to try and find the special mate. God had paraded all the animals in front of him, and he named them all, and he rejects them. He knows their names, as it were, and will never call them back again, just like the king, except for one, whose name delights him. It's Eve. Her name, Isha, signifies why she is perfect for him, why he will want to spend the rest of his life with her. Isha, the hey at the end of Ish, means from Ish, from man. It's like he's saying, I've called her by name and I know she's perfect for me. It's like later on, the king will select his queen only by calling her by name. Now, if it was just this, you might say, well, that's a very interesting coincidence. 2 beauty contests in the entire Tanakh, and the other one just happens to be in the story of the creation of Eve way back in the prelude to the Tree of Knowledge. But even if I accept that, you said that this was a forbidden fruit story, another Tree of Knowledge story. How is that the case? Well, let's keep on reading. So Eve has been created, and there she is in the garden. And she's surrounded by all these trees. And she can eat from all these trees. Life is pretty unrestricted. But there is this one command that she has to follow. There's this forbidden fruit, and it contains this mysterious forbidden knowledge. And Adam and Eve are both told that if they get this knowledge, they're going to die, they're going to become mortal. Ultimately, of course, Eve does take the fruit, and she gives it to her husband to share in this forbidden knowledge. And now, let's come back to the Megillah. After the beauty contest, what happened? Is there a command given to the Megillah's version of Eve? Is there forbidden knowledge which she dare not impart to her husband? Absolutely. It's her identity that becomes the forbidden knowledge. Esther is chosen queen, the Megillah says, but Ein Esther Magedet Moladata. Esther would not tell of her identity, her birthplace, that she was in fact a daughter of Israel. Ka'asher tziva aleh Mordechai, because Mordechai had commanded her not to. One more time, there's a woman who must not impart knowledge to her husband. It's forbidden knowledge. It could get you killed. And by the way, it's not just the general idea that's the same here. The language is the same here. Back in Eden, Vayitzav Hashem Elokim ala Adam lemor, God commanded Adam saying, but actually, literally speaking, it's not God commanded Adam. Vayitzav Hashem Elokim al Adam, God commanded upon Adam. It's actually a strange kind of language. It's not the way you would normally say it. But interestingly, that same strange twist appears in the Megillah too. A command upon. Ki Mordechai tziva aleha shelo tagid. Mordechai had commanded upon her not to say anything about where she comes from. And while we're considering language here, if Mordechai really is sort of occupying the God role, as it were, from the Garden of Eden, in other words, God was the one who had commanded Adam and Eve the first time about forbidden knowledge, and now Mordechai is the one issuing those commands to the new Eve, to Esther, about what she must and must not tell her husband. Isn't it interesting that the text talks about him strolling in the palace gates, using a very strange word, Mordechai mithalech. Mithalech is a hitpael form of walk, and it's a very unusual form to describe a person walking. It would sort of mean that he took himself for a walk. This is the last time the word mithalech is ever used in the Hebrew Bible. You know when the first time it's used is? Back in the Garden of Eden. When God was mithalech in the Gan, God was strolling in the garden. Seemingly, the Megillah is cueing us in here. Mordechai really is occupying the role of the commander in this case, the one who commands about forbidden fruit. But if all of this is correct, if the interaction between Mordechai, Esther, and the king really does mimic the Tree of Knowledge story, The Megillah's version of that story is about to get turned on its head. You may be aware that the Megillah is a topsy-turvy book. In the words of the Megillah itself, v'nahafochu, and it was all reversed, and here too. We're going to get an incredible reverse right in the middle of this tree of knowledge replay. Mordecai, the very person that had commanded Esther not to impart this forbidden knowledge about her true identity to the king, now comes to her and says, "Tell him the forbidden knowledge." Haman has issued his decree. Now you have to go and tell him who you are and beg him to save your countrymen. The one who says you can't impart that knowledge, whatever you do, never say anything, now says, no, the reverse is true. Go feed the forbidden fruit to your husband. It's interesting that the Megillah, who had used the word before, tzivah, command, to characterize Mordecai's insistence that she not tell, now uses that same word to characterize his insistence that she does tell. In the words of the verse, "U'litzavot alea lavo ala melach," and he commanded her to come to the king. And what does Esther say in response? She says something that actually fits totally like a glove with his tree of knowledge theory. She says, "I can't do it. I'll die." Well, if you're thinking tree of knowledge, it's no wonder. Whenever you give forbidden knowledge, death is right around the corner. Anybody who goes to the king without being called achat dato lamit, they're taking their lives in their hands, they're going to be killed. And now you want me to go, what? And give this forbidden knowledge, this really unpopular news to the king, that his queen is from that really unpopular nation, the one that his Secretary of State is going to wipe out in one blood-soaked Holocaust-like day? I don't think he's going to take that too well. Yeah, he might have been happy to take a queen from among any commoner. But now that Haman has made the Jews the dregs of society, how happy is he going to be to hear that I'm from them? If it wasn't bad enough that I'm going to go to him when I'm not invited, listen to what I'm telling him. You think he's going to want to hear this? It's going to be off with my head. And now, as if to complete the sense of the complete reversal of the original Tree of Knowledge story, listen to what Mordecai responds to her. No, Esther, you got it the other way around. You got to go to the king. If you keep silent, one way or another God will save us, but you and your father's house are going to be ultimately destroyed. It's death you're worried about. If you don't go to him, that's when you will be destroyed. It's a complete reverse. So she says, fine, I'll take my life in my hands. I'll go to the king and impart to him this forbidden knowledge of who I really am. But then she says, you know, if we're going to play topsy-turvy, I have a command for you. Lech knoset kol hayudim, gather all of the Israelites together. B'tzumu alai, and you and them fast. Al tochlu, do not eat. It's as if Esther is saying to him, you know, it began, Mordecai, when you told me I mustn't share forbidden knowledge. You want me to eat of the forbidden fruit and to give it to my husband? Then I, the commanded, will turn around and make a command of you, and that command of you will be, do not eat. And Mordecai listens. Vayas kechol asher tzivta alav Esther. He did all that she commanded him. So it's like everything has reversed itself, the entire Tree of Knowledge story, and therefore Esther is now left with a very serious challenge. She's got to tell the king who she really is. It's like Mordecai is telling her, find a way to give that forbidden knowledge to your husband. Way back in the garden, Eve gave Adam that fruit, and the results were disastrous. Now you need to find a way to give him the forbidden knowledge in order to avert a disaster. If she finds a way to accomplish this task, she will redeem that original Tree of Knowledge story. She will go through the exact same act that Eve did when she gave the forbidden fruit to Adam. Using the medium of food, just like Eve, at a banquet, she's going to give knowledge that's very, very dangerous to her. She's going to impart this knowledge to her husband. Except that act, instead of being destructive, will be the most compassionate, saving thing in the world. It will not kill, it will save us all. As we shall see, though, Esther faces a very, very great challenge. In order to somehow give this knowledge to the king in the right way, she's going to have to do it in a way that distinguishes between the two types of good. She's going to have to clearly demarcate what desire looks like, and how that's different from the right thing to do. When she does that, she will have finally redeemed the great tree of knowledge sin. How Esther does this forms the climax of the Megillah's narrative, a climax that we will understand ever more deeply when we keep the tree of knowledge in mind as we read it. We'll do that when we come back in our next video.
Ooh, okay. So I like what we've heard. So go back to the beginning. And he mentions this. He says 2 stories are going on in parallel. Both have garden stories, meaning they're both related, that they both have choices. Which, remember, the garden story doesn't necessarily mean you have an Adam and an Eve, a husband and a wife, right? But it's how these characters are behaving in their roles and how they respond. Because these people are making the same and different decisions. So it's going to be interesting to see how we will play this out, because we also have a king involved. Yeah. But we can see them making these decisions in a parallel story and saying, okay, this is good. This is what I like. I like the choice I made. I say it was good. Is that desire? I had a thought that might be worth discussing amongst yourselves, right? How we might view this good thing in a different way, at least maybe alongside. So the rabbi talked early about good, right? That he puts that between moral and desire, right? So I want to toss this out for pondering. Maybe moral is about how we treat another, right? It's about how the other is treated. Whereas desire, much more about and focused on maybe on ourselves. So there's an element of consideration between the focus on good, what is good for others, and the what is good for me. Yeah? Food for thought. Yeah. Because if I'm selfish and I think about how to make the system work for me, desire. But if I'm unselfish and I ask, how can I do the right, moral, and just thing? Not just because it helps me, but really because it should be how that will help others. Do you see the difference? I guess it depends how you look at it. Because remember, you're looking at it. It's all about me. Tends to lean heavily on that desire side. Instead, maybe considering how this will reflect on and affect somebody else might change your perspective a little bit. I talk about here a lot, right? The phrase I use on the Dusty Feet is upside down. Thinking this is a different way, not opposite maybe, but it's an upside down way. Kind of like it. So the apparent garden parallels in the story, right? As he's drawing this picture, they're really astounding. The king is parading. He's trying to figure out who's going to replace his wife. We get that exact parallel thinking. We see this only one other place. It's in the garden story. And I think it's there just because it wants us to draw us into the story, to start to think, as the rabbi puts it so many times, where have we heard this before? Where do I want this to connect you to? So this is the point. Because we're constantly reviewing this. We've seen these patterns before. So if we're unsure, then if there's more to it, there's more connections, maybe that's just helping us make that connection more apparent. Yeah. So I like where the rabbi went with the parade in front of the king, right? Esther was chosen. She's chosen as the king's mate. And yet, as we continue in the story, we still see that Esther has choices to make, just like Eve did. Esther's going to act in that ezer kenegdo. Looking back, we see the result of the choice. But the elements in the story suggest it wasn't an easy choice. But do we embrace all of the turmoil, right? That all the characters involved in this and all the choices that they make. Because I think one of the differences in the Garden of Eden story is how we might understand it, right? This is open for discussion, please. Talk about this amongst yourselves. Was there any turmoil in the decisions that Adam and Eve made in the garden, both before and after the fruit? Because I think we're not sure in the garden. I think the story would suggest there's more inner turmoil. But I think here we'll see as the elements unfold, because here we're just looking at it because we want to make the right, moral, and just call this time. That things are going to change, right? And maybe in doing so, though here, we're focused on giving up ourselves. Because we can look back and see the result. But it was a real fear when they're living in the moment. And I think maybe that's part of what we lose, right? We all get the results. This is what God wanted to happen all along. I just don't think it works that way directly because we have the garden story. And we have this story. And we have many others. And we see choices. We still have to make choices. And we hear stories about those choices. These are not fictional stories. And I'll put up for discussion, I don't maybe think they're supposed to make us feel good. Quite often, now we're discovering this, for instance, in the Scroll of the Judges on our Outside the Class series, choices can be very uncomfortable, even if you're God's chosen. Just because you're being or have been chosen by God does not mean that you're going to make the right and moral choice, especially if that choice involves others. That scroll, it is a very stark example. Because I think this is the only scriptural tapestry in which the stories cover the truth. A lot the negative, the not so good side of the stories are emphatically told. And they're often told with unbridled, even brutal honesty. Often it's not pretty or comfortable, but it is genuine. The choices are authentic. And in this story, with Esther, Mordecai, and the king, again, the choices they have to make are real to them. Remember, the rabbi said we have that knowledge in the forbidden fruits scenario, right? We have the information now. So it's a little different from the garden because I think in that they didn't have the place to apply something. Here we do. So Esther holds back some information because Mordecai tells she's not ready yet. But yet now it's time, right? Remember that analogy in the part of the story about Jeff Goldblum in Jurassic Park and the scientists? Because they were also worried, and they talked about whether they couldn't stop, even if they should. She could have told him who she was. Remember, we don't have Haman's edict yet in the story, at least when she's chosen as the king's bride, especially when we first meet Mordecai and Esther, and he warns her not to. But again, I highly suggest that you read this story. Read Esther's scroll, because you'll understand the timing of how all this plays out. Because sometimes here it's not always crystal clear. So you really need to be aware of that. So now we're at this point in the story where she could have told him before, but Mordecai said she shouldn't because it's not time. But now, after the Haman edict, all that plays out. And he says, now it's time. Now you got to tell it. But how would the person receiving the knowledge take it? How would the king react? Because Esther's greatest fear, really, is how her husband, how the king is going to react. So as we get to this part of the story, it's starting to get turned on its head in a sense, right? So to speak. We have the thought of what you're doing, but this time the focus is not only on what you're doing, but how it's for someone else. Because let's be clear here, because the fear that Esther has, if I say this, he's going to kill me. And Mordecai's telling Esther, if we don't do this, you might die. You're going to die. Your family is probably going to die. The possibility that could happen. Still, God will rescue us. But you have the chance in your choice to do the right thing. We hear about everything, but sometimes we're unsure what that looks like, right? We believe God will work it out. We just don't know how it'll happen. Sometimes we see somebody, something happens, and we can see their involvement in God's part of the story. So that's pretty cool. But what if somebody else in the story, they had a chance to make an Esther-like response, but they chose not to see God's thing play out? Maybe we'd never see the other side of that story. All we know is who we see, for example, in this story. Because Mordecai tells her, God will rescue her, but you must do the right thing because it's right. Is there risk to you? Meaning to yourself? So Esther's going, it's going to cost me. It could cost me, but I'll do it. I'll do it because it's about the others. So as one point gets towards the end, and this is why I have a slightly different opinion, right? Esther's response to Mordecai about the rest of the children of Israel fasting. Hear me out. Because I'm not as compelled that it's like a reverse order back. Everybody here, I think, needs to be on the same page because their lives are at stake. I was having a chat with men's group. We talked a little bit about this story, and I mentioned when I was going through this scroll where Esther is saying, she goes, I want the children of Israel to fast, me and my court. Those were her young women, right? Those who take care of the queen. She wants them to fast too. And I thought about it. I sat back and I went, it'd be interesting because telling your court that they need to fast, because they don't know who you are. They don't know you're an Israelite. They don't know that you're a follower of Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh. Yeah? But Esther, she also asks them to fast for those 3 days while she considers this. You know, for lack of a better term, we might use the phrase today, while she prays about it. I think this is what maybe some of that looks like, because I'm mulling over this decision. Am I doing what's right? Am I seeking God and asking, Is this the right thing? Not just for me, but for everyone else involved. Is my praying about rescuing me, or am I focused on others, despite myself? Maybe even at risk to myself. And I'm working through the fear underneath, because that's a genuine fear. So we have people who are not directly part of the story. They are her court. They're not the children of Israel, yet they're involved. It's interesting. It's there for discussion. But Esther knows this is a big deal. We all need to be on board, all on the same page. So fast. Puts us all in the right mindset. We pray to God. We pray to God for what's to come. Things are going to ramp up. Next week, we get to dive back in. As we know, Esther decided to proceed with this. So now it's not just a matter of going to the king. Again, like the Rabbi said, it's about how I will do this. How will I approach him to make him understand so it doesn't get taken out of context? How do I give him the reverence he deserves as king without interfering with that, and still tell him the information that he's going to have to mull over himself and deal with? Be an Azer Kenegdo. She left him, as we'll get, by conveying the knowledge of the fruit, that between that desire and in this one, Haman's desire versus the moral and right thing to do. In this instance, save lives. So we'll get there next week. And I'm hoping you could continue to remember the transition word, that term, the role Azer Kenegdo, because I think we're going to get to see it play out. So thanks for joining us tonight for part 4 of our Can We Become Haman? On the Dusty Feet.